What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Sunday, September 14th edition of the Ship My Money show, NFL version. Forgot the name of my show. It's been so long. Haven't done one of these in a couple of weeks. Been really busy working on everything over at Run the Sims, getting projections ready to go for NFL. Everybody else been working on back end stuff, but we are live. Didn't have time to do a show week one, but good to go week two. Did get a late start. People in chat kind of knew that this wasn't happening at 9 a.m. Completely different reason than usual, though. It used to be that I couldn't do a 9 a.m. show because I would be really hungover and not feel like it. Now I wake up early. I was up in plenty of time to do the show, but I'm feeling good. I'm excited about football. I'm tweaking stuff. I'm playing around with lineups. And then before I know it, it's already 9 a.m. and I'm not ready. And so I still have to push the show. So same result, completely different reason. But good to go. Plan on doing this every Sunday morning going forward, barring unforeseen circumstances. I think we're at a point with projections now that their baselines and everything are how we want them. Shouldn't have to spend as much time as I did week one, just like dialing stuff in. So excited to do this show and going to kind of try and figure out the best way to do it using the Run the Sims tool. Obviously, my first time using it on screen. So going to be bouncing around a little bit, kind of trying to figure out what works best. But I am going to go through game by game. I will talk about each game, break down each game, answer whatever questions you have. And then at the end, go through the current player exposures that I have from the Run the Sims tool at each position. I was kind of thinking that's the best way to do it, because if I just go position by position, I'm going to end up skipping over a bunch of players that people want to talk about just because I happen to not have them necessarily. If I just go game by game, then we're not talking lineups at all. So I'm going to go that way. Just go through game by game relatively quickly and then hit on player exposures at the end. As a reminder, you can sign up for Run the Sims using the link in the description below. A bunch of different packages over there for whatever you're trying to do. We have an NFL props package as well. We have a $25 a month projections and the ability to sim up to 5 lineups at a time package if you are a lower volume player or you just want access to the projections. So really, I think no matter what you play or how much DFS you play, there is something for you on the site. Link is in the description below. So getting into it here, starting with the Rams taking on the Titans in Tennessee. Rams side of this one, I think, is the more appealing of the two. They do have the higher implied total. Puka and Kyren Williams, I think, are clearly the focal points here. Puka got banged up in week one, had the bleeding eye, only ended up playing like, I think 65% of snaps, something like that. But obviously would have played more if he hadn't gotten hurt. So I'm assuming that he ends up in that like 85-90% route participation range this week. He should dominate targets even with Davante Adams here. That's clearly just who he is. He dominated targets last week. I think he had something like 11 targets on 21 or 22 routes run. It was something absurd, even with Adams there. So, like, obviously Adams cuts into targets for Puka, but like, you have to remember that what Puka's done in previous years was with Cooper Kupp there being a high target guy as well. So it's not like Adams is necessarily a negative in that sense. Easily could be a positive. Like, Davante Adams can draw plenty of targets and still be less of a target monster than Cooper Kupp was at times. Adams, in the red zone, obviously a red zone threat, but Puka should get targeted really, really heavily. Really like him here, especially in full PPR. Obviously, he's fine on FanDuel as well, but should just draw a million targets, earn a million targets, and I think looks really, really good. You can see here we have him projected very high, and I think that's one of the highest wide receiver projections on the slate. Kyren Williams, once again, just full bell cow role for the Rams in week one for, I think, the third offseason in a row. We had Sean McVay talking about how the Rams needed to mix in more running backs. They drafted another running back in Hunter. He was inactive week one. Blake Corum, maybe finally going to step up and be the backup. No, they just still go with Kyren Williams. He gets all the carries pretty much, and is reasonably priced, coming in at $6,300. Like, that's a pretty cheap price tag for a guy who, he's not very involved in the passing game. You can see over here only like a 7% target share for Kyren Williams, but very, very heavily involved in the running game. Should get the vast majority of not only carries overall, but also goal line carries. He's not somebody that you're worried about coming off the field in the red zone or anything like that. So he projects well for that price tag. I think him and Puka are the guys that really stand out from the Rams. If you get to some Adams, clearly that's going to be fine at 5,900. It's Devontae Adams in a Sean McVay offense. He is clearly second fiddle to Puka in the passing game, but I think that's fine. If you bring along Matthew Stafford with those guys, okay, but not, one of my preferred quarterback options on the slate. But I do really like Puka a lot at 7,600. I like Kyren Williams at 6,300. I think those two look pretty good. Moving over to the Tennessee side, not a ton of interest here. Tony Pollard and Calvin Ridley, I think, are the two most interesting pieces by a pretty big margin. You do have a very cheap Cameron Ward as well, but there's just plenty of good quarterback plays this week. Ridley and Pollard both relatively disappointing in week one, but also both very, very heavily involved. Calvin Ridley ran a ton of routes. He should be the number one target earner in this offense. He doesn't have a lot of competition there. You do obviously have to contend with playing with a rookie quarterback, but aside from that, as far as just, opportunity goes, it should all be there for Calvin Ridley. He's only 4,900, projects reasonably well, getting 8% ownership. I think that looks fine. And then Tony Pollard, this was a spot that I was really interested to see in week one, because if you went back to last season, there were, I believe, 5 games that Tyjae Spears was out for Tennessee. And in those games, Tony Pollard was an absolute workhorse. It was not any sort of a timeshare. It wasn't any sort of a timeshare for Pollard, mixing in with Chestnut or anything like that. It was just Tony Pollard being very heavily involved, not only as a route runner, which obviously that opens up with Spears out, but also in terms of carries. And then we saw it again week one. Again, he wasn't overly productive, but of the carries in that game that happened with the score within 10 points one way or the other, 86% of them went to Tony Pollard. Like, he's just dominating the workload in this backfield. He is reasonably priced at 5,900. He has pretty much all of the rushing touchdown market share, outside of Cam Ward. Like, you're not expecting anybody other than Tony Pollard to be getting goal line carries for this team. So I do think he looks good at 5,900. He's getting 12% ownership. I think that's fine, even though, the Titans are underdogs. They have one of the lower implied totals on the slate. You do get passing game involvement from Pollard as well. And again, he should just be handling like every carry. So I think those are the two that stand out. If you want to go down to Ao Manor at 3,200, 4% ownership. He did run a lot of routes last week. You're still talking about being not a primary option in a offense that isn't going to be like super pass heavy or super efficient in the passing game. But he is 3,200. The opportunities, he should be on the field. Same goes for Chigokonkwo at 3,300, getting 6% ownership. Either of them as value pieces, as a last guy in, are fine. I still think that pricing is soft enough that neither of them are going to show up as true priorities, though. Moving over to the Niners taking on the Saints. Mac Jones starting in place of Brock Purdy here. That's an overall downgrade for the Niners offense. Say what you want about Brock Purdy, about his contract, whether you think he deserved it or not. He is a better quarterback than Mac Jones. He is very important, obviously, in making this offense function. You also have a maybe somewhat banged up Christian McCaffrey, certainly a banged up Juwan Jennings, but he is expected to play. So you have this Niners offense. You're missing George Kittle. So you do expect efficiency to go down a bit here for the Niners just because of the quarterback play. And because at some point, no matter, if it's a Shanahan offense, McVay offense, whatever, those coaches are better and they are going to be able to make quality adjustments in general. But eventually you start running out of NFL quality players. You take Brandon Ayuk out of an offense, you take George Kittle out of an offense, you take Brock Purdy out of an offense, you're going to see an efficiency decrease, or at least you should expect to. But the positive side of it is the ceiling becomes high. Like, just because you expect an efficiency decrease doesn't mean it's always going to happen in a one-game sample. And when the offense does do well, it's pretty clear where most stuff is going. Like, obviously, Christian McCaffrey, he dominated opportunities in week one. You expect that to continue. You take Kittle out, that's even more either check down passes from Mac Jones to McCaffrey, or more work for Ricky Pearsall, for Juwan Jennings, assuming that he is able to go and, be on the field. There's not that many options in this Niners offense. So kind of the same reason that you expect, or part of the reason, the main reason you expect efficiency to decrease is the quarterback. But part of the reason that you expect the offense to struggle a little bit is at this point, limited skill players. But that, from an upside standpoint, is also kind of a good thing, where if the offense does well, it's very likely that it's going through, there's only a few guys, that you would really expect it to go through at all. $7,500 McCaffrey, obviously good if you can get there. $5,300 for Pearsall looks good. $4,800 for Jennings. Pearsall getting about double the ownership of Jennings. I think that is how it should be. You have Jennings banged up. I'm not completely sold that, 3 weeks from now or something, Jennings is the number 2 behind Pearsall. I still think that's pretty open. But we have seen Pearsall, when given the opportunity, produce, and he ran more routes than Jennings last week. Jennings obviously was banged up / holding out through training camp. Now you have Jennings that didn't practice a lot this week. So I do expect Pearsall to be ahead of Jennings. I think he is the better play for $500 more. He projects better, as you can see on the screen. But there is still plenty of upside for Jennings. You're just taking on more risk because of the injury and not knowing exactly how much he's going to be on the field and all of that. But we saw last year, Jennings, it wasn't just a matter of like Jennings was a good DFS player because there was nobody else to throw the ball to. Jennings was legitimately effective as an NFL wide receiver. He played very, very well when given the opportunities. So there is some upside there. Larry said, what do you set for simulations number? Say you were doing the pylon 15 entry, etc. I don't know what the pylon is. If you mean 15 entry large field, like I set the most simulation. It does for the simulations number. So I assume what you're asking about here, if I click over to settings, the number of simulations, I'm always just setting to the top because I want to run as many as I can. The contest field size, you're going to want to make close to whatever you're playing. And then the number of lineups really is going to be time dependent. If you're in a crunch, you're probably not going to want to do the maximum number. But the only thing that I really, assuming that I have time, and that goes for simulations too. Like if you are running out of time, maybe you don't want the maximum number. But assuming time isn't a huge constraint, the only thing that I'm really adjusting based on contests is the size of the contest field, and then also the payout structure over here, getting more in line with whatever I'm playing. But the number of simulations, the number of lineups, assuming I have the time, I'm just getting as many as I can because why not? Getting back to the Niners and trying to find where this tab is. Getting back to the Niners, Jones is 4K. He's getting 6% ownership. Anytime you have a 4K starting quarterback that we know, like Mac Jones isn't good, but he's not Nathan Peterman. You can play him. Again, I don't think it's super necessary on this slate. I don't think when I looked before the show, I was personally getting to him, but clearly, like, he's the cheapest quarterback in play. He does have guys that you can pair him with. You pair him with McCaffrey, you pair him with Pearsall, and then you have a lot of salary to spend elsewhere. I think he's viable. Not personally my favorite because, again, I just think there's enough underpriced guys on this slate. Like, pricing isn't super tight. You've already seen it, $6,300 for Kyren, $7,500 for McCaffrey. There's a lot more of that coming. So this isn't one of those slates where there's nobody hurt this week and there's a bunch of games with like $10,000 running backs that I really want or $9,000 wide receivers I really want. One, there's not that many appealing games in general on this slate. So the payout priorities there aren't as many like payout priorities as there are in general anyway. And then also pricing's just pretty soft. Jake asked about Bourne. I don't really have much interest in him. I think if the argument for Bourne like would be we don't know. So maybe he just goes in. We saw like a 40% route participation for Valdez-Scantling last week. And maybe Bourne plays more than that. So like the argument for him in like a Millie Maker would be, we don't know. Maybe he just goes out there and he's like the primary number 3 receiver, or maybe Jennings is more hurt than we think and he's the number 2 receiver. So that uncertainty at low ownership and a cheap salary in like the Millie Maker makes a lot of sense. Especially if like you're going to Niner stacks, or you need a cheap wide receiver. It's not something that I think is particularly likely. But the opportunity is there. Like, my expectation is that behind Pearsall and Jennings, you get routes split between Bourne and Valdez-Scantling, but that doesn't have to be the case. And if it's not, then yeah, Bourne would look good at 3,500. So there is more volatility on Kendrick Bourne, and I guess to some extent Valdez-Scantling also, than there typically is going to be on sub 4K wide receivers, because not only do you have the typical volatility that comes with football and being a receiver, but you do have input volatility where we don't actually know exactly how they're going to use Kendrick Bourne this week. So, and again, to some extent, Valdez-Scantling, just because he ran 35 to 40% of routes last week doesn't mean that he's not going to run more this week. We saw last season that he can have stretches where he's just the guy that you need every single week, even if he's only getting 2 targets, as we saw last year. But yeah, it's one of those like prototypical, I think, like Millie Maker type plays. It's not something that I expect to have much of personally, or would be going out of my way to get to. The other thing that kind of hurts him here is, again, like the pricing on this slate being so soft. Once you start playing around with lineups, I haven't done this too much on DraftKings yet, but on FanDuel, for my dummy lineup, I actually like decided to go through and just make a lineup that I liked. And I was like running into the problem where I would put in players that I like, and then I'd be like, well, this is just stupid though, because I can turn T. Higgins into Jamar Chase. Like, yeah, I like T. Higgins, but I have the salary for Jamar Chase without sacrificing anything. And I think you have pretty similar pricing on DraftKings too, where like you're just, in a lot of cases, not all cases, but in a lot of cases, I think you build that lineup with Kendrick Bourne, and it's going to be, well, like Todd said, there's other 3K receivers too. Like there's other cheap players, but then the mid range is also cheap. The upper end is cheap. You're just going to have a lot of lineups where you're like, oh, this lineup looks pretty good. I can see Kendrick Bourne having that game. And then you're like, okay, well, wait a minute. What if I just like turn Kendrick Bourne into somebody a lot better without sacrificing really anything else in my lineup? I think you're going to run into that problem a lot from a roster construction standpoint. Moving over to the Saints side here, Spencer Rattler, another cheap quarterback, 4,800. Decent projection on him, not a good quarterback, but does give you some rushing upside, does have a concentrated group of guys to throw the ball to, which is always nice from a stacking standpoint. And his receivers are cheap. His pass catchers are cheap. So the Saints, while they're not a super appealing offense at all, they have a low implied total. They are a decent value stack here, I think, at some ownership. 17% ownership coming into Kamara at 6,100, 12% coming in to Chris Olave, none projected right now to Shaheed, which I think is really weird and maybe changes. If not, like I assume I have a decent amount of him right now. No ownership coming into Rattler. I don't want to go crazy there, but I do think it's kind of an interesting stack. And we did see something interesting week 1, not only in the sense that targets really condensed to Olave, Shaheed, and Juwan Johnson, but this was something pointed out by, I think it was Jacob Gibbs on Twitter. It might have been Ryan Heath. It might have been somebody else. So I apologize if I fucked up who said it, or maybe several of them said it. But they had pointed out that Kellen Moore historically has not been somebody that designs a bunch of plays for any particular player. Even going back to like the Cowboys, CeeDee Lamb didn't get, that many designed plays. And obviously Alvin Kamara has lived off of the short passing game, screen passes, especially from a fantasy standpoint, throughout his career. And we saw that play out in week 1. Now, obviously there's no guarantee that week 1 equals week 2 equals week 3, etc. But when you have that sort of like background knowledge of like, okay, this is something to watch out for with this, the change in this offense. And then week 1, Kamara is just not involved. I think he had 2 targets. Kamara not involved as a pass catcher. And then you see Juwan Johnson run like 100% of routes or something like that. He's getting more of the short work. Obviously, Olave and Shaheed are your 2 primary receivers. They're always going to be involved as long as they're healthy. That's something that I do think is interesting. And that's the kind of thing that I do want to kind of try and jump on before everybody else reacts. And this is something that I've talked about on other shows and stuff. Like the difference between doing projections for yourself and doing projections for subscribers is trying to like walk that line, because you don't want to just like rush to a conclusion and say, okay, I think Kamara is like functionally different this year than he has been every other year, and make him project really poorly, and then all of your subscribers miss out when it just turns out that was a 1 week blip and Kamara catches 10 passes this week. But at the same time, I'm going to use our projections, and I think that there is good reason to think that, like, not that Kamara is going to completely disappear, and sure, he's still going to have some games where he catches plenty of passes, but I don't think this offense is going to run through him as much as it has in the past. I think you're going to see more Johnson. I think you're going to see more. We saw a very low ADOT on Shaheed last week. That is a big difference from what we've seen from him in the past. In the past, he's been the big play threat, low catch rate, but when he catches it, it's for a bunch of yards. He had like a 5.5 ADOT or something in that range last week. So if they're going to use him more as a short range guy, that's going to increase his reception projection. It's going to lower his yards per catch. Olave is, still Chris Olave. So I do think there's a little bit of that of a different Saints offense here potentially than we've seen in the past, and it affects target distribution a bit. So that is something to keep in mind. I don't think I'm getting to too much Kamara. Again, I haven't looked too closely yet, but I do think, we have a 14 fantasy point projection on him. That's not low for 6,100, or it's not bad for 6,100, but I do think it's a little bit lower than the industry in general from what I've seen. Olave, I think, looks pretty good at 4,900. Juwan Johnson at 3,600. I think looks pretty good. I'm kind of surprised he's only getting 4% ownership in full PPR. He's the kind of guy that I don't really like as much on like FanDuel, because he's still fine because he's a cheap tight end, but you don't have a ton of touchdown equity on the Saints. This isn't a team that's likely to score a bunch of points, but you do have a bunch of, this is a $3,600 tight end that might just be running 6 yards, turning around and catching 7 passes or something. So I am interested in Juwan Johnson here, and that's sort of, if we're a little bit lower than market on Kamara, market meaning other, industry projections, it makes sense to be a little bit higher on Juwan Johnson, because it just kind of seems like that's the way that this offense is going to go, is a little bit more participation in the offense for Juwan Johnson, a little bit less in the passing game for Alvin Kamara. So I do think that's an interesting spot to get to as well. So not a team that, I expect to score a ton of points, but they are cheap, and especially in full PPR, I do think the Saints are pretty useful here. Obviously, Kamara at 6,100, like if you just disagree with what I said, or you just don't want to react quite as quickly, he is cheap. Like, clearly there's upside there. And one nice thing about our projections as well, as you can see on the screen, if you just think week 1 was a blip and you're not worried about the Kellen Moore stuff, you can just go in here, change market share to whatever you want, click normalize. It'll change out all the other Saints so that everything equals 100% market share. And when you run the Sims, it'll increase the projection on Kamara using that market share. So that's one thing I really like about our projections, is you don't have to say, well, 14 seems low, let me make it 16, and have like no fucking idea what you just changed or how it affects anybody else on the Saints. You literally can just say, I think this is too low, I'm going to make it higher, and it will proportionally change everybody else, rerun the projections, and give you the actual correct projection based on what you think. So that's something that, I really like a lot. You can play around with that. Moving on to the next game, we have the Seahawks taking on the Steelers in Pittsburgh. Seahawks were run heavy week 1. That was something that I really wanted to pay attention to, because it makes a lot of sense for an offense that has Sam Darnold at quarterback and has Kenneth Walker and Charbonnet at running back to be run heavy. And also, has a defensive-minded head coach. They were not run-heavy last year, obviously different quarterback. So that was something I wanted to pay attention to. Obviously, again, it's 1 week, so you're not just assuming that it carries over to every other week. But logically, it would make sense for them to look to run a bit more this year. And we did see that in week 1. This is another team that has a relatively low implied total. A lot of teams on this slate do. Not really interested in Sam Darnold here. He's not getting any ownership. Charbonnet and Kenneth Walker, not particularly interested in either of them either. We saw a really nasty split between them in week 1, and that was a big, big change from what we had seen last year. I think that people kind of tend to, because Charbonnet is such a good handcuff, and when Walker does miss games, Charbonnet gets all the work. I think people tend to kind of think sometimes that this backfield is a timeshare when they're both healthy. And in the past, it hasn't been. It's been Kenneth Walker dominating work and Zach Charbonnet standing on the sidelines watching. But that's not what we got week one. We actually had a higher market share, rushing market share for Charbonnet than we did for Walker. And if you're going to actually split carries between them, it makes a lot of sense for the Seahawks to do that. It absolutely sucks from a DFS standpoint, from a fantasy standpoint, for them both to be healthy and splitting carries. Now, maybe it's because Kenneth Walker did miss a good amount of time in preseason. Maybe, that injury was legitimate. There was a lot of talk that they were just, resting him because he didn't need the work. So maybe we do see that market share increase for Walker going forward. But at the same time, it does make sense that you have two good running backs. Why not just mix them in and maybe actually keep them both relatively healthy throughout the season? So for now, I don't really see any reason that I wouldn't expect a split backfield here as opposed to Walker, being the guy. So not really interested there. Sherlock said Walker basically didn't have a training camp, so I'd expect him to be business as usual by like week 4. Yeah, that's entirely possible. And I don't necessarily disagree, but it's also entirely possible that the Seahawks are just like, okay, we have this one running back that we give every carry to when he's healthy, and then he always gets hurt and misses games. And we have this other good running back that we give no carries to when the other running back is healthy. What if we just give them both carries and lower the wear and tear on the guy that always gets hurt? So I don't know what the answer is. And for week 2, for now, it doesn't matter. Like I personally don't know how I would like play either of these guys on this slate. There's a lot of good running backs to get to. The case for either of them would just be they're talented, and maybe one of them just has a blow up game. But outside of that, and you can see no ownership projected anyway. The only guy here that is interesting, I think, is Smith and Jigba. $6,000 price tag is cheap. Now, working against him, he's getting 12% ownership. Working against him is that the Seahawks are not likely to want to throw a lot unless they get behind and are basically forced to. But he really doesn't have much competition for targets. We saw him break out at the end of last season, start getting a lot more targets and being really, really efficient as well, which actually Yuta pointed this out to me. We were talking about it in DMs. I mentioned that it felt like Smith and Jigba played really well and had a breakout the second half of last season. And then you look at like his target share, targets per route run, all that stuff. And it's like, okay, it was good, but it didn't skyrocket like I expected it to. And Yuta pointed it out that part of it is that Smith and Jigba was just getting so open and beating guys so bad that he was just housing a decent number of his targets. And so it kind of ends up being, you see this with running backs sometimes. Derrick Henry, always outperforms his expected fantasy points. But it was kind of like he was potentially taking some targets away from himself. So either way, like I think JSN looks very, very good from a ceiling standpoint. Cooper Kupp is there, obviously, but this is not likely to be the target dominant Cooper Kupp that we saw with the Rams. It's the JSN show in the passing game. I think the upside is very, very high for him at 6K. 18 fantasy point projection looks pretty good there. Kupp, at 5K, not getting any ownership. It's still Cooper Kupp, I guess, but you're getting him outside of the McVay offense. You're getting him with Sam Darnold. I don't expect much from him, and I think that there are just plenty of other good wide receiver plays. On the other side, for Pittsburgh, no ownership coming into Rodgers. You're getting a little bit of ownership to Jaylen Warren. You're getting a little bit to DK Metcalf. 5,500 Rodgers. I have a little bit of interest. I think that the Steelers may throw here a bit more than the industry thinks. This is one of the bigger question marks, I think, about exactly how this offense operates. Because when you think of the Steelers, you assume they're going to try and be somewhat run heavy. If you go and look last season, like obviously they were more run heavy when they had Justin Fields at quarterback than when they had Russell Wilson, but they're still looking to run the ball even when they had Wilson, even though obviously it was at a lower rate than with Fields. The Jets last year had one of the lowest rush rates in the league. And part of that, obviously it's a different team. It's not a Mike Tomlin coach team, et cetera, but Aaron Rodgers is also just going to do whatever the fuck Aaron Rodgers wants to do. And so I think that my expectation for the Steelers coming into the season was somewhere between what the Steelers did with Russell Wilson last year and what Rodgers did with the Jets. I think they're going to run more than you saw Rodgers run with the Jets. And I think they're going to run less than they ran when they had Russell Wilson at quarterback last year. In neutral game script last week, and obviously it's one game and it was a weird game that shot out when nobody expected it to, the Steelers ran like 29% of the Steelers ran on 29% of their plays in a neutral game script. They were basically average in passing rate over expectation. So we didn't get any like definitive answer on what they're going to do, but I didn't get anything to like change my opinion that they're probably going to be a little bit pass heavy or more pass heavy than like they were last year. So that makes Rodgers project a little bit better. Still, though, you're not getting any rushing upside with Rodgers, and there's plenty of quarterbacks on the slate. So, like, I don't think he's a priority. I just kind of like him a little bit more than the industry. DK Metcalf, 5,900 is interesting because he's low-owned. DK Metcalf. Aaron Rodgers is not a terrible quarterback. He should dominate targets here. One thing that was really interesting from week one is that we got a much lower ADOT from DK Metcalf than he had in Seattle. We'll see if that continues or not. But that is something where, you know, if he can get it done after the catch, great. And you would expect it to increase his catch rate and his receptions over time. But it also, if that is just what they're going to do, would lower, you know, the amount of big home run plays that DK Metcalf has. So basically, I think he's an okay, you know, low-owned tournament guy. But I do think the Steelers throw a little bit more than expected. Jonnu, 3,900. Decent projection on him, only getting 1% ownership. I do like the upside that he gives you. You did have him splitting routes with Pat Freiermuth and Darnell Washington, which is pretty much expected. You had like a 25% route participation for Washington as the third tight end. I think Smith, off the top of my head, ran like 50 to 55% of routes last week. Certainly could get some short work. Just saw that mentioned in chat. I think that, you know, we know that he is a capable fantasy producer. He can do things with the ball in his hand after the catch. So the upside is there for him at 1% owned. I wouldn't say he's any sort of a priority. I haven't looked at my tight end exposures, but around 50 to 55% route participation for both him and Freiermuth. That was pretty much my expectation coming into the season, that you would see a lot of two tight end sets for the Steelers. You would see both Smith and Freiermuth on the field. I kind of thought you would see more of both of them and a little bit less of Washington. So I wasn't thrilled to see 25% routes from Darnell Washington. But at the same time, I get it. Like, that's another big pass catching guy that they have. One interesting spot, too, in what we saw last week was Calvin Austin dominated routes amongst the non-DK Metcalf receivers. DK Metcalf ran like 95+% of routes last week. Calvin Austin came in at 85%. Next highest was Roman Wilson at 21. So there's no guarantee that carries over week to week. You could certainly see some sort of rotation or just volatility from week to week. But if Calvin Austin is just going to have a stranglehold on wide receiver 2, that is really valuable here, given how often you expect the Steelers to have two tight ends on the field. It makes the slot receiver or the third receiver not super valuable because they're not going to run that many routes because they're going to get kicked off the field for Jonnu/Freiermuth. So if you're going to get Austin as just the other receiver, as opposed to a rotation at wide receiver 2 between the other receivers that are not Metcalf, that is actually something to pay attention to. And at 4,700, we know Calvin Austin is a big play threat. He did still have a similar ADOT last week to what he had in previous seasons. No ownership coming into him. Not somebody that I would want to like prioritize at wide receiver because there are so many good wide receiver plays without going to the wide receiver 2 on the Steelers. But I did want to point it out that very, very bullish route participation for Calvin Austin last week compared to his competition. So that is something that was interesting and that stood out to me when I was going through the Steelers. In the backfield, 5,400 for Jaylen Warren is really cheap. He's getting 6 to 7% ownership. I think a lot of weeks he'd be getting more ownership because of that price tag, but you just have such weak, soft pricing on running backs and really everybody this week that you run into that situation where, okay, cool, I built a lineup I like. It has Jaylen Warren. Oh, wow, I can sacrifice basically nothing and get to Kyren Williams or something like that. We did see Jaylen Warren as the clear number 1 ahead of Caleb Johnson. we did not see him as the clear number one ahead of Kenneth Gainwell. Gainwell was very involved as the running back too. He was involved in the passing game. He also got carries. So that is problematic, obviously. Projecting around a 50 to 55% rushing market share for Jaylen Warren, 30% for Gainwell. I assume you're getting Warren around the goal line more often than Gainwell. Rodgers is not a quarterback that's super likely to steal rushing touchdowns, so that's good for Warren. Caleb Johnson being basically a non-factor in week one was obviously big. If this were to turn into like a 3 running back situation, that's an absolute mess. But 5,400 in a timeshare for Warren, where he is still going to get some passing work and probably most of the goal line work and probably most of the carries, is still fine at 5,400. I think that looks like a pretty decent value, but again, you just don't need the value all that much on this slate. You can get the higher upside running backs for not that much more salary. Bears taking on the Lions in Detroit in what will be a very interesting game to pay attention to. The Lions in week one not only look like shit against a very good Packers team, they played slow, and that is obviously pace, and run pass distribution is something that you're going to want to pay attention to. Since Ben Johnson is gone, we don't know exactly how this team's going to adjust. It's very easy and logical to make the assumption that, hey, this offense was really good under Ben Johnson. Let's try and do a lot of things similarly, play at a fast pace, et cetera, et cetera. Logical things do not happen very often in the NFL. New coaches come in, they think their way is better, even though it's probably not. And we just see a lot of really stupid shit. So do want to pay attention to if the Lions are going to get in their own way or not. It should be pretty difficult to screw up an offense that has Jahmyr Gibbs and Montgomery and Goff and St. Brown and Jamison Williams, but coaches do it all the time. So will be interesting to see if that was a one-off against a good Green Bay team or if this Lions team is just going to not live up to potential this year. For the Bears, we saw them throw a good amount week one against the Vikings. That was expected. Teams generally do attack the Vikings through the air. You have Ben Johnson coming in, which was just likely to increase pass attempts for Caleb Williams. Mixed results. Obviously started off the game very good, then took a step back. He's 5,400 here. He's getting 5% ownership. No problem getting to that if you want to. The upside is there. You do get rushing upside as well. We saw a lot of non-intended scrambling rushing attempts for Williams in that Minnesota game because the line just couldn't get it done. So whether they're designed or not, you do have rushing upside. You have some touchdown upside for Caleb Williams. DeAndre Swift dominated backfield touches. How long that continues, we don't know. Rashawn Johnson is back this week. Monangai was not involved at all on the ground, or pretty much period, in week one. Maybe that changes. Swift was not efficient, but Swift is 5,700. He did have a stranglehold on running back work in week one. He's getting 3% ownership. Again, a lot of slates. Maybe that's interesting. This one, I think it just puts him in another category of like another guy in that category of like, yeah, he could have a good game. The opportunities are there, but there's going to be bigger priorities. DJ Moore, Roma Dunze, both secondary wide receiver plays, I think. Reasonable pricing, but again, that is just the case across the board. Those are the two guys that are going to stand out at receiver here. You expect them to basically be wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 1A and 1B. Moore got some rushing work week one as expected as well. I did lower that a little bit now with Rashawn Johnson back, but do still expect Moore to get a couple touches out of the backfield. Also, he does project a little bit better than Odunze, but Odunze is a little bit cheaper, a little bit lower owned. Either of them are fine as secondary plays. Neither one looks like a priority. At tight end, we saw a split between Kmet and Loveland. Neither of them are going to look super interesting this week. We need one of them to kind of take over. Obviously, you expect it to be Loveland sooner than later. They are both sub 4K if you just want to throw a dart at a talented pass-catching tight end. They do both fit that mold, but neither of them are going to look like guys that I really want to get to. The Lions side is the much more appealing of the two to me. I do expect them to be relatively run-heavy here. We saw them, like I said, play slower week one, which is not ideal and hopefully doesn't continue. But you do have them at home here as like, I think 6.5 point favorites against the Bears. It does set up as a spot where I think they're going to run a good amount. You can see the 50% rush rate at the top. Jared Goff is cheap though at 6K. He's not getting any ownership. I know when I did take a quick look at my quarterback exposures before the show that I had a lot more Goff than I anticipated. I anticipated getting to a lot of Gibbs. I really like him. I was surprised by Goff, but I don't mind it, like if that's showing up, because he is cheap. He does obviously have high upside guys to throw to. I know I don't have him projected for a lot of pass attempts, slightly below the prop market in attempts for Goff. So that's one of those things where, like, I've had this conversation. People always ask about adjusting exposures after the fact. This is kind of the perfect example of, like, I was surprised to see that I was getting to Jared Goff. It's not something that when I went through the slate, I was anticipating or necessarily like hoping that I would get. But I'm not going to just go, if I run my process and Jared Goff is showing up, I'm not going to go like just get rid of him to get rid of him, because I already know that if anything, I projected him low. Like I projected the Lions to run more than I think the market is projecting them to run. I'm a little bit low on Jared Goff pass attempts. So if he's still showing up, then whatever. And he's cheap at 6K. So again, not my personal favorite, but low owned Goff, low owned, just take the name out of it. Low owned 6K quarterback in a dome throwing the ball or on an offense with St. Brown, Gibbs, Jamison Williams. Like, okay, it doesn't take that much to sell me on it. You're not getting much ownership coming into St. Brown or Jamison Williams. Again, I don't think that either of them are like the best respective, plays at their respective salaries or positions, but clearly you have a very high ceiling for both of these guys. I expect the game to go through Gibbs and Montgomery. Doesn't mean it's going to. And if it doesn't, clearly it's going through St. Brown, Williams, Laporta, who's getting 8% ownership at 4,800. So the upside is there, even if it's not necessarily the most likely way that this game goes. This Lions team does have one of the highest totals on the slate. And as I mentioned before, this is not a slate that has a ton of really appealing games. Somebody had asked if there were a couple games that I was interested in as a shootout. I like the Jacksonville-Cincinnati game. I'm interested in the Patriots-Dolphins game. The Dolphins did just put 2 linemen on IR, which is not ideal, but I'm interested in that game. But like, we don't have like 54, 55 point totals on this slate. So pretty much every game I think has, even the good games, the appealing games, have some sort of like, yeah, but type thing. So I like the low and upside the Lions are giving you, even if they weren't something that like I kind of sought out in my head. What did stand out to me was the Gibbs and to lesser extent Montgomery combo. I really like Gibbs at 7,400. I think that's a pretty cheap price tag. He's 8,300 on FanDuel, which is relatively inexpensive over there as well. Obviously, you get the split backfield, but it does set up as a game environment where they are likely to be relatively run heavy in general. We know that you're expecting more of the passing game work to go to Gibbs, and he's just somebody that anytime he touches the ball can make a huge play, can house one, can really break a slate anytime he touches the ball. So maybe you get people off of him a little bit because of week 1, how unappealing the Lions were in general. He obviously didn't have a good game, but I like going right back to him. And then Montgomery, not as much a priority for me because he doesn't give you the same sort of PPR involvement, but 5,400, if they are playing with a substantial lead, that is the type of game where you do get more work for David Montgomery. Obviously, he gets plenty of work around the goal line. So there is upside for him. If you have a lineup that just doesn't have any of the Goff, Gibbs, St. Brown, Williams pieces, and you want to get to the Lions, Montgomery makes a ton of sense in that type of build where you're just saying, well, what if this is just a really run heavy game for the Lions? What if they just don't have to throw because Caleb Williams plays like shit? They get some short fields because the defense gets turnovers and the Lions just never have to really put their foot on the gas. David Montgomery gets a bunch of carries, falls into the end zone twice. It's not hard to envision the David Montgomery game playing out. So I'm getting, I think, to more of the passing game, but I agree with whoever in chat mentioned David Montgomery as well. Really, I just like the Lions in general. Like, they're not getting much ownership outside of Gibbs. They have a high total. It's one of these games where like the median projections aren't necessarily the best outside of Gibbs because there are so many mouths to feed on this team. But in any one game, like some of those mouths are probably getting fed. Again, assuming that the new coaching staff doesn't just completely screw up this offense. So median projections are going to be down because when you're projecting a game, you have to account for all of these guys being involved. But in any given game, you have the game where ASB gets a ton of targets and Williams isn't involved, or Williams and ASB get a ton of targets and they just don't run, or whatever. Montgomery gets a ton of carries and nobody else is involved, kind of thing. So I just like getting to the Lions in general. Kind of just, pick your preference, I guess. Ravens taking on the almost said Guardians. Browns in Baltimore. Cleveland, another team with a low total. Ravens, very high total. This game does have the biggest spread on the slate. It's the only game with a double-digit spread. Likely to be a run-heavy game, obviously, for Baltimore. That is very good for Derrick Henry. It is fine for Lamar. You do run the risk with Lamar of you need him to get the early touchdowns, probably. If you get a game where the Ravens jump out to a 21-0 lead or something like that, and it's because Derrick Henry has already scored, 2 or 3 times or something, Lamar's probably in trouble because he's not going to have to do that much the rest of the game. But clearly, he's such a big part of the offense. He is such a good rusher. He gives you so much rushing touchdown equity that even though they are big favorites, it's not necessarily a big downgrade for him. He is just such a big part of this offense. They have a 28-point total. Lamar looks very good. He's going to get ownership. He deserves it. He's the highest projected player on the slate. Derrick Henry, 8,200, looks very good as well. Obviously, going to typically look better on FanDuel than on DraftKings since it's half PPR instead of full PPR. But I expect him to get the ball a ton. Have him projected for, I think, like 20 carries or so this week and over 100 yards rushing. I think his prop is like 94.5, 95.5, something. Should be a Derrick Henry game if you can afford him. He looks very good. Zay Flowers is interesting to me at 6,200. Getting 10% ownership. Again, like it's not a game where you expect the Ravens to have to throw the ball a ton, but he is relatively affordable. He is likely to be heavily involved when they do throw the ball. He ran routes on nearly 100% or 100% of routes last week, or of dropbacks last week, rather. So you have a very heavily involved wide receiver 1. Obviously, Bateman is good as a wide receiver 2, but he's not somebody that's drawing a ton of targets away from Flowers. Derrick Henry's not, super involved as a pass catcher. You're missing Isaiah Likely. So Mark Andrews will still get his targets and be on the field more than he would if Likely were in. But there's a lot of work available for Zay Flowers, which I think is really interesting. I do like getting to him, especially in your Lamar lineups or even just, as a one-off. Obviously, he can be the one that, puts them ahead with 2 touchdowns and, 5 catches or something early on. So those guys look good. Andrews, 4,700, getting 7% ownership. He's just another of a million decent looking tight ends. But Lamar, Flowers, Henry, the guys that really stand out to me from the Ravens side. From the Cleveland side, I don't know why I started with the Ravens. Also, I don't say too much about defenses in general, but I am really interested in the Ravens defense here, not just because the Browns have the lowest total or whatever. Like, I think that's a trap that people fall into a lot of times with defenses, is chasing a defense against a team with a low implied total. That doesn't necessarily correlate with fantasy points. What I like is that you have a statue in Joe Flacco that is probably going to drop back to pass 40 plus times or something in that range in this game. You have a Ravens defense that can get a lot of pressure, can get sacks, can force turnovers from Flacco. This sets up as just kind of like the dream spot for a DFS defense, not even talking real life defense. Cause Flacco can, pull a random good game out of his ass and score points, but you just have this guy that is going to drop back a bunch. He's not going to make anything happen with his legs. He's going to take risks. He's going to throw the ball into traffic. He's going to give you interception opportunities. He's going to give you sack opportunities. The Ravens are expensive, but I do actually like the way this sets up, which for, usually for defenses, it's like, I don't give a shit, just click whatever fits. But it does set up really, really nicely for this Ravens defense. Now, getting to Flacco, he is 5K. He is probably going to throw the ball like 40 times or something. So that inherently gives him some upside, but not somebody that I want to really be getting much of. I don't think. He's only getting 1% ownership. There's no real ownership coming into the Browns outside of a couple of spots. 7% coming into Jerry Jeudy, $5,300 price tag. Looks fine. I would be interested in the 3% ownership coming into Cedric Tillman. I don't think there's a big difference between $5,300 Jeudy and $4,300 Tillman. I think that you're going to see it kind of just be a week-to-week basis for them, where, some weeks it's Jeudy, some weeks it's Tillman, a lot of weeks it's nobody because it's the Browns. But I don't totally understand why a $4,300 Tillman on a team that's probably going to throw 40 times is only 2% owned. That is interesting to me. Harold Fannin is probably going to be the most popular player from the Browns, and he should be. $3,100. Ran a bunch of routes last week. We saw a lot of 2 tight end sets where essentially, the question had kind of been like, who's going to be the wide receiver 3 for the Browns? I think the answer is Harold Fannin, because we saw him ahead of Thrash. We saw him ahead of Bond. So one thing that I think is important to note is that David Njoku did not lose routes. Njoku still ran like 85% or so of routes, didn't have a good game. In tournaments, if you want to go to $4,400 Njoku instead of $3,100 Fannin, I do think that's fine. Like, Njoku's still going to have good games. It wasn't a case of Fannin replacing Njoku. It was a case of Fannin playing alongside Njoku. And obviously, if Fannin is going to continue to draw a ton of targets, then that is bad for Njoku. But Njoku is still playing a lot of snaps. So that is something to keep in mind. Like, make sure you don't have that incorrect takeaway from week 1 that Fannin jumped Njoku on the depth chart or anything. Njoku ran more routes than Fannin. Njoku did not lose his role in terms of being on the field running routes whatsoever. But Fannin, 3,100, especially full PPR, just looks really, really good. I would assume he's the cash game tight end. I'm not playing cash. I didn't build cash lineups. It's not a cash game show, but I assume he's the cash game tight end at 3,100, especially again in full PPR where you don't need the Browns to score a lot of points. You need the $3,100 guy to catch like 6 passes, and you're good. He ran like 65% of routes last week. So I do think him being chalky makes a lot of sense, especially in full PPR. But I did want to highlight Njoku as a pivot away from him at lower ownership. The routes are still there. The backfield's going to be a mess. You have Judkins active this week. So that I assume he's going to play some number of snaps. My guess here is that the pecking order is Sampson, Ford, Judkins in his first game, but who knows? We saw Sampson catch a ton of passes last week. This was another kind of interesting spot where I think it was easy to have like at least a partially incorrect takeaway. Obviously, it's very, very good that you saw Sampson so heavily involved as a pass catcher. He had something like 50, 55%, 52% targets per route run. Jerome Ford ran way more routes than Dylan Sampson did. So it's not so much, at least yet, that Sampson is in there as like the pass catching back and he's getting most of the carries and he's just doing everything. He was just very, very heavily utilized as a pass catcher, which is still obviously good. Like, you don't lose fantasy points because he didn't run a lot of routes or something. But I did kind of want to just highlight that like this backfield is still very, very messy. Then on top of that, you have them as a double-digit dog. You're trying to figure out how Judkins fits in. If you went to anybody here, I think it has to be Sampson, but I would rather just not. Moving on to the Patriots and Dolphins. This is a game that I do find interesting. I think that there's just a lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainty here, and some things that suggest it could be a little bit more fantasy friendly than maybe people are thinking. At the same time, like, I have seen this game talked up also, so maybe people are thinking it. I don't mean that in the sense of like I'm smarter than everybody or I know more than everybody. Both of those things may be true, but I don't mean it in this sense. But I just mean it in the sense that like New England at Miami doesn't jump out as like, oh, that's a fun fantasy game, but I think it actually might be. Also, it's not going to feel good to get to because it's New England at Miami. But starting with New England, they were actually first in passing rate above expectation last week. They threw a lot. They also ran a very fast-paced offense, a lot of no huddle. Drake May gives you rushing equity, rushing upside at 5,200. I think he looks good. If I can get to him, very happy about that. Cheap price tag. This is, one of the quarterbacks that makes it so, you mentioned those other quarterbacks like Flacco, like 4K Mac Jones, etc., where they're just not really that useful because you can just play somebody like Drake May at 5,200 that gives you rushing upside, that is on a fast pace, potentially pass first offense. So I like getting the May. The backfield is pretty gross. If you're going to go to one, I would go to Henderson, but no ownership really coming into either guy. You got split carries last week. Henderson probably going to catch more passes than Stevenson, you would expect, but neither one really stands out here. Diggs getting 2% ownership at 5K is interesting to me. I'm a little bit higher on him than I've seen other places. And it's not that I'm like super high, a 12 fantasy point projection isn't crazy, but I just don't. I have trouble like finding reasons to lower it. We saw a lot of routes run by Kayshon Boutte last week. He looks like the clear, wide receiver 2 at 4,500. He's getting 2% ownership if you wanted to go there. Diggs ran like 70% of routes. I think it's likely that you see that number tick up as we get further into the season. He is somebody, that was dealing with some stuff. There were questions around his health in the preseason, in the offseason. Like, I assume eventually you're getting up to like 85% routes from Diggs. So I still haven't projected around like 70 to 75% this week, but he's cheap at 5K. You're on an offense that maybe is going to throw more than expected. I do find him interesting. I don't mind getting to Kayshon Boutte here either at 2% owned. I just think the lack of ownership here is a little bit surprising. Pop Douglas at 4,300 is getting none either. He is third behind those guys in terms of priorities for me. Hunter Henry at 4K gives you another tight end that looks just like all the other tight ends. But I do think the Patriots are just kind of an interesting offense. I'll be interested to see what I'm actually getting to in terms of exposure, because this is one of the teams that I do actually like when I go through the slate. And so are the Dolphins. I mentioned that they lost 2 of their offensive linemen. That's always something that's very, very difficult to quantify from a DFS standpoint. Like, obviously it's not good, especially when 2 is your quarterback. But then you think about the Dolphins offense too. And like, you could make the case that it's not the end of the world when you're talking about an offense that already looks to get the ball out of Tua's hands quickly. They already use Achane in the passing game as an extension of their running game. Jalen Waddle had like a 4.5 yard ADOT in week 1, which obviously isn't ideal for big plays, but can certainly be ideal if the thinking is, all right, we need to get the ball out of Tua's hands. Okay, we have Waddle running 4-yard routes at a time. So in full PPR, like, it's not good, but it's hard to know exactly how much of an impact that has. So what I did, and talking with Yuta and getting his take on it, we did lower plays a little bit, total plays for the Dolphins compared to where we had it, and then increase plays a little bit for the Patriots, because that is obviously something that exists. Like, if the Dolphins are not running a play, the Patriots are. So that was kind of the change that we made, but I don't think it's necessarily a huge impact on the Dolphins. Again, like, you would prefer that they have those guys. But the things that I like about the Dolphins, one has to do with what I just said about the Patriots. Pass-heavy offense that was playing at a fast pace. If your opponent plays at a fast pace, obviously that gives you the opportunity to get more plays. But they also have to not be holding onto the ball the whole time. If your opponent is throwing more, you also get the opportunity to have more plays, because incomplete passes stop the clock. So there is the potential for the Dolphins to get additional plays here as a result of the Patriots. Also, the Dolphins are kind of a tricky team if you just look back at their tendencies from last season, because they played, roughly half the season without Tua. In the games that Tua played, they were a very, very pass-heavy team. They passed above expectation in week 1. I believe they ranked 12th in pass rate over expectation in week 1. They were a very pass-heavy team with Tua last year. And it's also a relatively concentrated offense. You still don't have Waller. So, we don't know what Tyreek Hill is at this point of his career. We don't know what's going on in his personal life. But you do still have an offense where you expect the vast majority of it to run through Achane, Hill, Waddle. If the Dolphins, and this is kind of like I was talking about with the Niners, obviously there's volatility here where the Dolphins could just have another god-awful game like they did last week. But if the Dolphins do have a good game, it kind of has to involve good games from at least some combination of Tua, Achane, Waddle, Hill. And so, and Malik Washington to a lesser extent. He's somebody too, by the way, that could benefit from, just an even bigger emphasis on a short passing game, getting the ball out of Tua's hands. He's another guy that can make big plays after the catch. He's 3,300. He's not getting any ownership. You don't have much ownership coming into $5,400 Waddle. He's also $5,400 on FanDuel, by the way, so really cheap price there. $6,400 Hill, 7% owned. I like the Dolphins. I like Achane a lot. He is getting ownership at 14%. He's the only double-digit ownership on the Dolphins. $5,300 Tua is cheap. Doesn't give you rushing upside, but he's cheap, and if he's able to connect with Hill, Waddle, obviously gives you passing touchdown upside. So I like the Dolphins. Again, this is an interesting one for me. Like I'm curious to see where my exposures actually end up, but I like both sides of this game, at least in my head on paper. It's not going to feel good clicking either team, but especially the Dolphins after what we saw last week. But we do at least know how it happens if the Dolphins do well. Jags and Bengals, another game likely to be one of the more appealing on the slate. Two pass-heavy teams, or the Bengals in particular, pass-heavy team. Bengals give up a ton of plays in general as well as a result of being a pass-heavy team. The Jags look like shit week one. Remains to be seen how quickly Liam Cohen can make this offense functional. But we do know that they have quality pieces. Trevor Lawrence may or may not be a quality piece, and I guess people have different takes on ETN as well, but he certainly looked good week one. Brian Thomas, we know, is very good. Travis Hunter, probably very good. Ran a lot of routes week one. 32% target per, or 0.32 targets per route run week one. Clearly very good. Obviously going to come down in other weeks where Brian Thomas gets more, but you have both of those guys. You have Strange as another just perfectly fine playable tight end. The backfield split here pretty much was non-existent last week. ETN was just the guy. Then they trade Tank Bigsby. My assumption here is ETN is still the guy. Tootin is your running back 2. Allen is your pass blocking back. So I still like ETN here. He's cheap at 5,700. He's only like 6,700 or something on FanDuel as well. Getting 12% ownership. Should be heavily involved. Bengals defense sucks. I like Travis Etienne. And I like the passing game if you can get to it. Lawrence is cheap at 5,600. Hunter's cheap at 5,200. Even Thomas is reasonably priced at 6,700. He's getting double-digit ownership along with ETN. But I like getting to the Jags in general. Again, I don't know if I actually am, but I like it on paper. The matchup is really good. Big play threat in Thomas. Hunter looked, certainly good at 5,200 in terms of earning targets in his first game. De'Ami Brown, I'll mention as well, not getting any ownership, but like your Millie Maker type play. Where maybe you stack like Lawrence, Thomas, Brown, or something like that. There were pretty big questions about exactly how wide receiver 3 was going to play out for the Jags, where you have De'Ami Brown, who they got in the offseason. You have Washington. They traded for Tim Patrick. Obviously, maybe they just like work Tim Patrick into the offense more than in week one. But in week one, you had 85% route participation, give or take, depending on what site you look at. From De'Ami Brown. It was Brian Thomas, Travis Hunter, De'Ami Brown, and then just a massive drop-off to Parker Washington. So for at least week one, it was there was no rotation, no timeshare. De'Ami Brown was the wide receiver 3. So, again, in the massive field tournaments, if you are looking to get beyond the obvious Lawrence, Thomas, Hunter, De'Ami Brown had a stranglehold on those wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, whatever you want to call them, routes. Brenton Strange, clearly your pass-catching tight end as well at 3,600. On the Bengals side, clearly a very fun team to get to. They are going to be popular. It's the most popular team we've looked at so far. Joe Burrow, $6,600, probably throwing the ball 37, 38 times, something like that. Chase Brown, dominating touches out of the backfield again. Didn't have a good week one in terms of fantasy production necessarily. Did, I believe, score a touchdown, but then not really do a lot of anything else. But got all the opportunities. He looks very good. He is 6,800, very high upside option. Obviously, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, neither one had good game ones. Great bounce back spot for both of them here. 8,100 for Chase, 6,100 for Higgins. I like them both a lot. They'll both be popular. You can play them together. You can play them separately. You can play them with Burrow. You can play them without Burrow. Doesn't matter. Just play these dudes. They all look really good. They all look like top plays on the slate at their respective positions. Tight end was a mess week one. Noah Fant, Noah Fant, Mike Gesicki, kept saying Drew because it was right below him, but they pretty much split routes. Obviously, they're contending with Chase and Higgins for targets. So they're nothing more to me than like Millie Maker type dart throws. There are plenty of other tight ends that I prefer, but at the same time, like they are running routes for Joe Burrow against the Jags. So there is some upside there, but clearly the priorities here are just the guys that you would expect them to be. Drew Sample ran a bunch of routes as well. That was an issue. It wasn't necessarily unexpected, but this was another team with the Bengals where like there was the potential, or you kind of expected they would run a lot of 2 tight end sets using Gesicki, Fant, but then you're kind of hoping that like the route share breakdown is something like 50 to 60% Gesicki, 50 to 60% Fant. Instead, it was like 40 to 45% because Sample ran so many routes as well. That's something to keep an eye on week to week. And if you do see that start to change, it is going to make Gesicki and Fant start to look a little bit better. But for right now, it is just pretty much the guys that you would expect from the Bengals. As far as route participation out of the backfield last week, Chase Brown did lead the way, about 45% route participation. Pirine wasn't too far behind at 35%. He is probably going to be a little bit of a pain in the ass for Chase Brown this year, just in terms of being in on passing downs, because that's what he does. But Chase Brown clearly still massive stranglehold on the rushing opportunities and still getting a lot of passing game involvement as well. So this is it projects as the most fantasy friendly game, I think. Bills taking on the Jets in New York. Josh Allen, $7,100 price tag, getting 8% ownership. James Cook getting 6% at $6,400. Not much ownership coming into the passing game, but it is Shakir and Coleman if you go there along with Kincaid. No true priorities here, but obviously a very high upside team to get to. This is sort of like the Ravens, but with a little bit lower ownership, where it's tough to prioritize anything because there are so many mouths to feed, and or kind of like the Lions, I guess, too. There are so many mouths to feed, but in any given game like this, they still have like a 27 implied total. Obviously, Josh Allen, if they do well, is going to be very heavily involved. But I like James Cook here. I think it's a game that you could see the Bills go a little bit more run heavy. They are like touchdown favorites, give or take, against the Jets. James Cook is obviously explosive. He's good. Like, he produces when he gets his opportunities. So I am interested in him as a low-owned mid-range running back. I think that the upside for him is very high. One other thing that was interesting that popped up throughout the week, just working on projections, was, and this is something that I don't want to pay too much attention to because I don't expect it to be super sticky year over year, especially the defensive side of it. But the Bills last season, and I'm trying to get to this page so I get it right. The Bills last season were they had the third highest percentage of their touchdowns come on the ground. About 51.5% of the Bills' touchdowns last year were on the ground. The Jets last season allowed, of the touchdowns they allowed, 55% were on the ground, which is an absurd number. It's the highest by a lot. Now, again, touchdowns inherently are random. There's probably plenty of times that a Bills receiver fell down at the 1 yard line and that turned into a Bills rushing touchdown, even though it had nothing to do with the running game. And probably plenty of times the same thing happened against the Jets defense. So it's not something you expect to be super sticky, but it was something that just kind of stood out as well, if this does carry over, you have a spot where you'd expect a lot of rushing touchdowns. So minor kind of just point that is at least somewhat interesting if you're trying to get to some, or if you're trying to talk yourself onto some James Cook at 6% owned. Keon Coleman, 5,100, Shakir, 5,500. Coleman is a little bit more interesting to me since he's getting less ownership, actually projected a little bit higher, has, I think, more touchdown equity than Shakir does, just because of his size, his role. But what really stood out was we had a 90 to 95% market route participation for Keon Coleman week 1. That's up a lot. And we don't know what Keon Coleman is still in the NFL. There were big questions about him as a prospect when he came out. A lot of people thought the Bills drafted him too highly. A lot of people thought that he's just going to be a monster that catches 12 touchdowns a year from Josh Allen because of his size and his ability in the red zone. And then last year, nothing really got answered. He didn't have a great rookie season, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. He wasn't, he wasn't always utilized a ton, didn't always run a ton of routes. But now he is running a lot of routes, at least, through week 1. We had Curtis Samuel inactive, so that'll be something to pay attention to in 50 minutes when those come out. Larry said, was that just running back rushing touchdowns or rushing touchdowns in total? No, it was total rushing. So it included Josh Allen, which obviously, plays a part in it, but it would affect how you project. You would still expect a lot of rushing touchdowns from the Bills, and then you're splitting those rushing touchdowns based on how they play out between Allen and Cook. But no, it was total rushing touchdowns, which is why part of the reason the Bills were so high is Josh Allen. So for Coleman here, like, you maybe have a wide receiver 1 for Josh Allen at $5,100, not getting ownership. That's certainly interesting to me. It's not, I wouldn't say the most likely case is that, he's just about to start dominating, but like, he ran routes on almost every drop back last week. He had 11 targets. Obviously that game was an anomaly where the Bills were in a super competitive game and had to, throw and kind of put their foot on the gas. But there's certainly upside for Keon Coleman. Like, Scherer is good, but there's no like clear alpha receiver on this team. And maybe he steps into that role. I certainly would not be opposed to having him in my lineups at 3% when he starts to do it. So I do think that one's interesting, kind of even more so than Khalil Shakir to me. Kincaid at 3,700. Again, there's just a bucket of tight ends around 4K that they'll be good if they score a touchdown. They won't if they don't, basically. And Kincaid is one of them. On the Jet side, 5 to 6% ownership coming into Justin Fields at 5,700, 10% coming into Breece Hall, 8% coming in to Garrett Wilson, 3% coming into a $2,900 Mason Taylor. Justin Fields, great if you can get to him. We know, going back to his time with the Bears, it doesn't matter what you think of him as an NFL quarterback. It doesn't matter what you thought of him as a prospect coming out of Ohio State. The guy scores fantasy points. He runs a lot. Probably going to have like a 30 or so % rushing share for this team. He has a lot of rushing touchdown upside, makes big plays with his legs, and then just does enough through the air. He does have a good receiver in Garrett Wilson that he can throw to. Most of his passes will probably go there. So Fields, if you can get there, great. I don't think you have to stack him because there's not a lot to stack him with outside of Garrett Wilson, or, I guess if you want to consider Breece Hall a stack, that's fine. But you can play him naked. I think you can pair him with Wilson. Josh Reynolds ran like 100% of routes last week. He is out this week. Remains to be seen how that gets split up. If I were playing a Millie Maker and for some reason I wanted a non-wide receiver 1 that pairs with Justin Fields, Tyler Johnson would be the guy. Again, I don't really know why I would want to do that, but I know I did have a lineup last week that did pretty well that had Fields, Wilson, Reynolds at no ownership. Tyler Johnson ran a lot of routes last week, even with Reynolds in on pretty much every play and Wilson in on pretty much every play. Lazard was inactive. Again, we'll have to see what happens there, but my assumption is that Lazard will be active here, but also not ahead of Tyler Johnson. Don't know if that is actually true or not, but that's my assumption. And you had last week, Tyler Johnson ran like 55, give or take, % of routes. You had 100% from Wilson. You had 100% from Reynolds, 55% from Tyler Johnson, and then it was like 12% from Arian Smith. So I assume you're getting a lot of routes from Tyler Johnson as the wide receiver 2 here. Wide receiver 2 for Justin Fields is not a very valuable role, but he is unowned and dirt cheap, minimum salary, if you're playing, massive field Millie Makers, something to keep in mind. Breece Hall, interesting to me. The workload last week was kind of good, kind of not. He didn't run a lot of routes. He had like 32% route participation, which was higher than any other running back, but they just didn't run a lot of routes with the running backs. I projected him higher than that just because I think that number probably comes up in general. He did get most of the work. He lost the touchdown to Braylon Allen, but he did get most of the work out of the backfield. I think that he looks good here. My concerns are just the lack of routes in general. Justin Fields is the type of quarterback that you don't expect to be dumping off the court to running backs all that often because he's going to just run with the ball. So I do think at 6,200, like, Breece Hall looks fine. He is somebody that, like, you could expect some efficiency bounce backs this year. That was a weird way to word that. You could expect an efficiency bounce back this year as well. Just, another year removed from injury. So he is a little cheaper than he should be. I am a little concerned about mostly the lack of passing game involvement for anybody out of the backfield, especially because that does just kind of go hand in hand with having a quarterback like Justin Fields. So Hall does look, perfectly fine overall. Probably not my favorite option out of the 6 to 7K running backs. Like Kyren Williams is $100 more. ETN is $500 more. But Breece Hall certainly a solid enough play. Same goes for Garrett Wilson at 6,500. He's clearly the wide receiver one, and that's pretty much the only guy that Justin Fields is going to throw to. 8 targets last week on 24 routes, 0.33 targets per route run. Breece Hall was at 0.29 targets per route run, but again, he ran 7 routes is the problem, or my concern. But amongst the wide receivers, it was 0.33 targets per route run for Wilson, 0.13 for Reynolds, 0.14 for Johnson, 0.05 for Mason Taylor. Like if the ball's in the air, it's pretty likely to be going to Garrett Wilson. Unfortunately, it is coming from Justin Fields, so there is a lot of volatility there. He's getting 8% ownership. I think that looks pretty fine. Moving to the Giants and Cowboys. Going to try and get through these last 4 games a little bit quicker. Definitely need to work on pacing for NFL, but not having week 1. I had a lot I wanted to talk about, I guess. Getting to the Giants here, not too much ownership as far as like true priorities go, but there are some pieces to pay attention to. Russell Wilson, 5,100 is cheap. If you're playing Giants pass catchers, then by all means, you can pair Wilson with them, but he's not somebody that I would be looking to get to like, oh, I want to build this lineup around Russell Wilson. It would more so be, okay, this lineup has Malik Neighbors and Wan'Dale Robinson, and I need a cheap quarterback, so Russell Wilson it is. But Tyrone Tracy, 5,300. I was a little surprised by the prop markets on Tracy. I think that the running back situation is still very unclear because week 1 against the Commanders was just such a dog shit game for the Giants where they were never really in the game. We didn't necessarily get like clear cut answers on how their backfield shakes up. The prop market was quite a bit higher on Tracy than like my initial market share projections. And in a case like that, I do then kind of lean on the market because like I didn't have strong takes on what it was going to look like. But it was just kind of one of the bigger prop market things that kind of stood out to me during the week of like, this is an uncertain situation. And it seems like maybe, and again, like one thing I hate about the prop market, source of truth arguments that people make is then at the same time, you're going to have the same people tell you like, hey, we have a prop tool on our site, which we do, that you can use to beat props. So like either your projections are better than the props and you can beat them, or the props are the source of truth and you can't. It's a very beatable market. So I don't think that you should always be like moving or tailoring projections to props. But in a situation like that, where it's like, I have no fucking idea, let me kind of poll the audience, ask the audience. It did just kind of stand out as like, okay, like, I guess maybe I should be a little bit more bullish on Tracy still than I was after week 1. So that was something, again, just kind of something that stood out from the prop market in, I think, a really uncertain situation. You did get 10 carries for Tracy last week, 3 for Singletary, 2 for Scadaboo. So like everything did trend toward Tracy. In general, you had 8 for Russell Wilson, which like obviously you're not expecting to really be the case. So that kind of just threw off market share numbers in general. But very long way of saying Tracy's 5,300. You expect him to be involved in the passing game. You expect him to be the number 1 running back in a good matchup against Dallas. He looks pretty good. 7% ownership. I don't really have any issue with that. As far as route participation for Tracy last week, he came in at like 67%, dominated routes out of the backfield. So overall, I do like Tracy. I think he looks good. Again, you're just going to get volatility with the Giants because 1, they suck, and 2, we don't know really what the plan with Scadaboo is. At what point does he start to really get involved? He only had those 2 carries last week, but when does that change? Does he get goal line work over Tracy? We don't really know. How often are going to be around the goal line? Probably not very. But he is cheap. He is at least involved in the passing game, which is obviously good, especially, full PPR on DraftKings, and he is very, very cheap. So that's all good. Happy to get to him as a value running back. He projects pretty well. Malik Neighbors goes without saying. Happy to get to him. Looks good. Wan'Dale Robinson is questionable. Haven't actually seen an update on his status. I assume for now that he's playing. If he is, 4,400 is cheap. Relatively low ADOT guy that gets there on catches. 0.22 targets per route run last week, had 8 targets. Neighbors had 11. Obviously, Neighbors is a monster. He has a quarterback in Wilson that will throw the ball up to him, which is nice. Very, very high ceiling for him at 7,100. I think it goes without saying that Neighbors is the top play from the Giants. And then you're looking at secondary plays in Tracy and in Wan'Dale Robinson. For the Cowboys, 15% ownership coming into Lamb, 14% coming into Jake Ferguson are the 2 highest owned guys. Then you get some ownership coming into Dak at 5,900, to Javonte Williams at 5,800, to George Pickens at 5,800. God, I can't read. So this is one of the more appealing offenses to get to, I think, one of the higher owned offenses, not to the same extent that the Bengals were, but you do have ownership pretty much everywhere here on the Cowboys, and I agree with it. Dak at 5,900, perfectly fine price tag for the guy that's throwing to Lamb and Pickens and Ferguson. Lamb, one of the highest projected receivers at 7,800. Again, like I was saying earlier in the show, he's just the top end guys are underpriced this week. Lamb could easily be 8,500, 8,800, 9K, and you would still be looking to play him. 7,800 just looks really good for somebody that is, still going to dominate targets. And talked about this with Neil on the Cowboys Showdown show last week on Thursday, but the addition of Pickens is one of those things that from a fantasy standpoint, I think it has pros and cons. Like obviously Pickens is a higher target guy than players Lamb has played with in the past, but at the same time, Pickens is going to draw a lot more defensive attention than guys Lamb has played across from in the past. You still got 0.42 targets per route run for Lamb in game 1. That probably comes down in general, but he was still obviously heavily involved. 13 targets in that game. He looks great. The upside for Pickens is there too, though, at 5,800. Like, yeah, the targets are going to be less consistent when you're playing alongside CeeDee Lamb, but CeeDee Lamb is going to draw a lot of defensive attention. It's going to give Pickens opportunities down the field. And some weeks, like last week, it's going to turn into pass interferences that unfortunately don't get you anything in fantasy. But other weeks, he's going to actually go up and catch the ball and make big plays. So he's going to be I think, pretty volatile boom or bust guy, but the ceiling is going to be really high week to week for George Pickens. And that's the exact type of player that when they're low owned, I like getting to. And then when they're popular because they, caught 2 of those long passes the week before, I just get away from them, hope that the pass interferences come that week, and then we just restart the cycle and I go back to them at low ownership. You're getting low ownership on him here. So I do think Pickens makes a lot of sense, whether that's a Dak plus Lamb plus Pickens stack, Dak plus Pickens by himself. I don't really care. I think the upside is very, very high for him. Ferguson looks like one of the better tight end options at 3,800. Pass heavy offense, clear tight end 1, touchdown equity, good pass catcher, 0.22 targets per route run last week. 6 targets was the second most on the team. So that looks good. And then Javonte, we saw him as the clear running back 1 for the Cowboys. He himself is not super good or anything, but clearly being running back 1 on the Cowboys is a appealing role because it's a good offense and they just get tackled inside the 10. And then you get touchdowns for Javonte Williams. There are other running backs that I certainly prefer that we've already talked about. Denver taking on Indianapolis in Indianapolis. About a 22.5 total for Denver, about 21 for the Colts. Not much ownership at all coming into Denver. A little bit coming into Bo Nix at 6,100. A little bit coming into Cortland Sutton at 6,300. That's pretty much all that I see here. Evan Ingram still kind of up in the air exactly how many routes he's going to run. He did get banged up last week, but he played most of the game and wasn't out there running, like 80% of routes or anything. So maybe we see him more involved as time goes on. Running back was a mess last week. You have J.K. Dobbins as probably the running back 1 here. R.J. Harvey doing enough to be a pain in the ass, but then also Tyler Batty just running a bunch of routes and catching a bunch of passes. So Sean Payton said that it's really difficult to have 3 running backs involved. That would make you think that they're only going to have 2 running backs involved. But Sean Payton also spent a year and a half saying he needed to get Marvin Mims more involved in the game plan for a year and a half before he ever did it. So I kind of just assume they're going to keep doing what they were doing. and running backs here are going to be pretty tough to trust. If you were to go here, the hope would be, neither of these guys are going to get ownership. Maybe they do go down to 2 running backs. Maybe Dobbins does just take over and house 1 or 2, or Harvey just takes on a lot bigger role. Again, there's just so many good running back plays on this slate, though, that's not the route that I would most likely take. Marvin Mims did run a bunch of routes last week. He's not getting any ownership, which is interesting. Him and Franklin both ran like 60 to 65% of routes. We'll see if that continues or not for Mims. But he is 4,100. We know he's a big play threat. He's not getting any ownership. He ran a lot of routes, pretty much as many routes as you can hope for if you're not the wide receiver 1 in a Sean Payton offense. So, Millie Maker type guy at 4,100. For the Colts, Daniel Jones, 5,200. Somewhat interesting, 4% ownership. He runs a lot, has some rushing touchdown upside. Obviously, having Jonathan Taylor lowers that a bit, but you do get rushing production from Daniel Jones, not to the extent that you would from Richardson. Michael Pittman, 5,100. Alec Pierce, 4,100. No ownership to Pierce. Very little to Pittman. I do want to point out on Pierce, he played a lot last week. He was clearly ahead of Josh Downs in the wide receiver room. He is a low catch rate, high ADOT guy. So very, very, very volatile, but being on the field is obviously good. Seeing an increase in route participation is good. He ran routes on like 80 or so percent of dropbacks. Downs was down at like 50%. Pierce was between 85 and 90%. They were all very clearly ahead of AD Mitchell. So I did want to point that out on Pierce, that he was just out on the field a lot. Most weeks he's, not going to do much, but the weeks he does something, it's 3 catches for 80 yards and a touchdown at 4,100 and no ownership. At tight end, Tyler Warren looked very, very good right out of the gate. 4,500, looking like one of your better value tight ends. 8% ownership. That would be higher if you didn't have $3,100 Fannin. 5K, I think, or 5,500 on FanDuel looked like one of the better pay down tight ends there, especially since it's not full PPR, so it doesn't help Fannin quite as much. You do have a bit more touchdown equity for Warren than for Fannin. So like him quite a bit. He just looked good right out of the gate. He's expected to be good. He earned 9 targets, which was 1 more than Pittman. 0.39 targets per route run for him. 0.29 for Pittman. Those were the 2 high marks by a lot for the relevant pass catchers for the Colts last week. So secondary offense, but some pieces that are interesting. Forgot Jonathan Taylor, 6,700. Another just underpriced running back. Like should be 7,700, 8K, something like that. He's getting 10% ownership. Not only did he get all of the backfield touches again, like usual, rushing touches, he ran like 70 to 75% of routes. Jonathan Taylor, if he's going to be involved in the passing game, it completely changes who he is as a fantasy option. He's kind of been like Derrick Henry light in the past, where he's getting all the touches. He's getting, all the red zone work, all of that stuff. But he's not super involved in the passing game. If he's going to be out there running routes every, drop back or 3/4 of the dropbacks, that's going to make him obviously even better. So I do really like Jonathan Taylor this week. He's underpriced. There is reason to think he's getting more pass game work. So I do like Jonathan Taylor a lot. Sweetback Willie said, I like Scatterboo from the Giants. The numbers don't say it, but he was running hard last week. I assume you mean like as in like the player and not for DFS, because I think it would be very hard to like a DFS player that ran twice last week just because he looked like he ran hard. But I do agree, like watching that game, his runs kind of stood out just as like the style. So I do agree with you there. Neil said bots in the chat, Run the Sims has officially made it. Yeah, it's really distracting. Need to remember to take my ADD medicine before shows, I guess. Moving on to, I think, the second to last game. Carolina taking on Arizona in Arizona. For the Panthers, I think it's pretty much McMillan or bust. Hubbard, McMillan, or bust. Not a ton of interest in Bryce Young. Like, obviously, if you're playing 150 lineups in a milli and you have some young McMillan, whatever. But not a lot to like put him ahead of other cheap quarterbacks. Hubbard continued to dominate touches. That was one thing that I was not completely sure was going to happen and was interested to see in week 1, was that he did still dominate touches out of the backfield. He had 16 carries. Dowdle had 3. Young had 5. So still a lot of Chuba Hubbard. He ran routes on nearly 50% of dropbacks. Dowdle ran like 33%. So still the clear running back one. Didn't get much of a timeshare at all. Don't know if that changes going forward, but certainly didn't change in week one. So he looks good. He's 6K. On a lot of slates, I would really like that 6K. On a slate where it's only $700 less than, say, Jonathan Taylor, it becomes a little bit less appealing, but certainly a secondary running back play. McMillan, 5,400 is just really cheap. He is clearly the wide receiver one here. He doesn't have a lot of competition. Leggett is not particularly good. Renfro is not particularly good. They have Sanders at tight end. Like, they don't have a great tight end or anything like that. 0.23 targets per route run last week. 8 targets overall, ran 35 routes. He's obviously the wide receiver one here. He is cheap. Exactly what value the wide receiver one on the Panthers has is up in the air because we still don't know what the hell Bryce Young is. He looked like he was going to be out of a job at the beginning of last year. Then he looks like a stud, like better than CJ Stroud at the end of last year. And then back to being a shitty offense week one. So who knows? But at least from an upside standpoint, 5,400 for a stud receiver prospect that ran 88% of routes in week one, led the team in route participation. Renfro was at 83%. Leggett was at 78%. Clearly a high ceiling for him. Sanders did run the bulk of the routes at tight end, so that was good to see. 65% route participation to Tommy Tremble's 33%. Did not do much. He was targeted 3 times on 25 routes, but he was out there running, so there is that for an unowned $3,100 tight end. He is at least playable, but really I think it's Hubbard and McMillan from Carolina. Interested in the passing game for Arizona. Only 3 to 4% ownership coming into Kyler at 6,400. Saw him mentioned in chat a little bit ago, and I agree. I think he looks good here. Nice matchup against Carolina. Healthy team total at around 26. Only $6,400. Gives you some rushing upside and gives you a relatively condensed offense as well. Something I've mentioned, I mentioned a lot. It's just a little bit of a bump for the ability to play a quarterback in DFS is not only because, like, obviously you have to get the team right, like, to win. You have to have the quarterback do well. But if the quarterback does well, how confident can I be that I know who he was completing passes to? A team like the Cardinals, you can be relatively confident. Like, yeah, there's going to be some games where Michael Wilson scores or has a big game or whatever, or Zay Jones or Dortch. But usually if Kyler has a big passing game, it's either Marvin Harrison Jr., Trey McBride, or both of them. They dominate targets. They dominate everything in this offense from, through the passing game. So you're very likely, if Kyler is the guy, you're very likely to be right about who you pair him with. So $6,400 Kyler, not getting much ownership. Harrison, 5,800, getting 7% ownership. 6K McBride, clear, good pay up tight end. Bowers isn't on the slate to compete with him. Kittle's hurt. 15% ownership there. He's going to be pretty popular, but for good reason. They both look good. I like all 3 of those guys. $6,600 Connor, getting 15% ownership. I'm a little surprised by this one. On the one hand, he still looks good. Like, you can see he projects well here, 17 fantasy points. I'm a little surprised that he's projected to be more popular than Jonathan Taylor. I guess, on the other hand, you do have the Cardinals with a higher total and they're close to touchdown favorites. So it does make some sense, but the workload was split a little bit more than you would have liked in week one between Connor and Benson. There was a lot of talk in the preseason that Benson was going to be more involved this year. And week one, you got 12 carries for Connor. You got 8 for Benson. That is, not something that, like, Jonathan Taylor, for example, has to contend with. It's not something that, at least based on week one, ETN has to contend with at a similar price in Jacksonville. So, that is something to keep in mind here. There is very much the potential for the 15 to 20% of people that play James Conner to then be bitching on Twitter because Trey Benson is getting more work than they wanted. The counterpoint to that is it was one game. And if you guaranteed 60% of the rushing share to James Conner against the Panthers, he'd be like the highest owned running back on the slate. So he is a good play, and I do get why there's ownership there. I did just kind of want to point out the split. He was involved in the passing offense, 55% route participation week one. That's a little bit higher than we had seen from him in the past. So that's good to see. Demercado didn't really do anything to get in his way as like a third down back. So that's good. So, I think it's another team where pretty much the guys that you would expect are the good plays, but they are really good plays, I think, particularly Connor and McBride from a pricing standpoint. But I do like Kyler at quarterback. I like Harrison as a wide receiver option as well. And then finally, probably the best real life game on the slate. Philadelphia taking on Kansas City in Kansas City. I need to figure out what is going on with Xavier Gibson here at the top. But another game that should get some ownership. Jalen Hurts, Saquon, Brown, Smith, all getting ownership for the Eagles, and they all deserve it. If you need an absolute punt tight end, Grant Calcaterra, 2,500, not likely to be very involved in terms of drawing a lot of targets, but he does run routes like 70 to 80% of the time, or did run routes 70 to 80% of the time last season in the games that he started in place of Dallas Goedert, who is out this week. Kylen Granson should see increased routes as well, but I don't think that matters too much for DFS. But clearly with the Eagles, the guys that you're going to go to, and they all look good. None of them look like the top play at their respective positions, but they all look good. Hurts, Barkley, Brown, Smith. You had a very disappointing week one from the pass catchers for the Eagles, but perfectly fine spot for them to bounce back. They're not super expensive or anything like that. Saquon still dominated touches. They brought in Tank Bigsby. I don't expect that to make Saquon not dominate touches. So he projects really well, one of the highest projected guys on the slate, but he is relatively expensive at 8K at a position where there's plenty of mid-range guys that have very high ceilings. On the Kansas City side, $6,200 price tag for Patrick Mahomes at 6% owned. Hollywood Brown, $5,200, getting 17% ownership. I am disappointed to see that number. I thought for a while this week that somehow I was going to be on a little bit of an island there, but I'm not. Travis Kelce getting 9% ownership at 5K as well. He should be more involved as a pass catcher with no Xavier Worthy and obviously no Rice. But Hollywood Brown is the one that really stands out here at 5,200. I spent a decent amount of time trying to figure out how to not project Hollywood Brown quite as well this week, but I couldn't really find it. If you go back to his time last year, limited sample once he came back from injury, he was very highly, he was targeted at a very high rate when he ran routes. Now you don't have Worthy. You didn't have Rice last year. Now you also don't have Worthy. And then we saw, week one, again, not that you're just going to carry week one over to week two, but he was really the only guy that they threw to. He drew 14 targets on 44 routes, 0.32 targets per route run. You compare that to the other wide receivers. Juju was at 0.15. Thornton was at 0.12. Even Kelce was at 0.11. Like, Kelce probably comes up over time, but we are also talking about 2025 Travis Kelce. Like, how much is left in the tank there? Juju is 2025 Juju. Tyquan Thornton, it was a shock that he made an NFL roster this year. Hopefully it would be cool if he bounces back and ends up being good and whatever, but like, it was a surprise he made the team. There is really no target competition here for Hollywood Brown. Now, efficiency obviously will be an issue, but it doesn't matter that much if you're inefficient at 5,200 if you're going to get 10 to 15 targets, especially in full PPR. So one of my favorite wide receiver plays. I don't really have a way around that. He's going to be one of the most popular receivers, unfortunately, but he should be. Pacheco's work in week one was not ideal. He split more with Hunt than I would have liked. Hunt was getting some short yardage work as well. We didn't really get to see what they would do in the red zone, but Hunt continues to look like he's going to be a pain in the ass for Pacheco at this point. So I'm not really interested in the backfield here. Kelce, I think, is okay. I would probably rather go cheap tight end or McBride since Kelce is getting 9% ownership. That's in my head. I haven't looked at what I'm actually doing, but it kind of feels like that sort of like dead zone spot where I can probably improve something in my lineup without sacrificing too much by going down to the like $3,800 range, because, and kind of thinking it through from like a roster standpoint, it's not that there's one player in that range that I necessarily think is better than Kelce. Although, Ferguson would probably be like the most likely. It's more so if I'm playing a bunch of lineups, I'd probably rather just be picking from that giant pool of like 4K, 3,500 to 4K tight ends, and assuming a couple of them are going to beat Travis Kelce, than going to 5K for Kelce if I can improve anything in my lineup. But that being said, if I just have a lineup where I'm happy with everything and I have 5K, Kelce is obviously a perfectly fine play. But Brown is far and away my favorite play here. Millie makers, if you want to mix in some Thornton, some Juju, the routes should be there for them. There are not really other guys on this team right now to run them. And there should be some targets from Patrick Mahomes, which, the opposite of what we were talking about with McMillan in Carolina. Targets from Mahomes are very valuable things. So that would be good. In week 1, you got about 80% route participation from both Juju and Thornton. That's good. Like, there were three wide receivers that ran routes in week 1 to any substantial amount of routes, and it was Hollywood, Juju, Thornton. So you are mostly just dealing with the volatility of what can Juju do, what can Thornton do, more so than are they going to be on the field. They're going to be on the field, which does make them somewhat interesting low-owned guys to have in your Millie Maker type contests. So that wraps up the game by game. I'll take a quick look at the lineups that I built before the show. I have no idea what is in them, so take a quick look at those. I can see that it is a lot of Lions. Starting at quarterback, and these are ordered weird. It's going to annoy me. It's going to annoy you. Hopefully it'll be fixed by next week. The blue bar over here and the sort are by optimal rate, not by exposure. So it's going to confuse. I'm probably going to mess up what I'm saying like 6 different times. But the filtered exposure and the shady exposure, I used the shady advice portfolio tool to get 150 lineups from the lineups that I simmed. And that's the same as the filtered exposure and the top 150 exposure. So Lamar showing up in 14%, getting to a little bit of Allen, but below the field. I'm a little over the field on Lamar, a little over on Kyler, getting to 5%. He's 4% owned. I'm below the field on Burrow, which I don't love. I would like to have more Burrow. 19% Goff at 2% owned. Like I said, I didn't expect that one, but I don't hate the idea of just getting to a bunch of Lions. I am over on Tua. I talked about that one. I do like that one. It doesn't feel good getting to Tua specifically, but when it goes well, I think it goes really well. When it goes poorly, it probably goes really poorly. Mixing, other than that, kind of just mixing in exposure to quarterbacks. I have a little bit of cheap Spencer Rattler. Same kind of thing I talked about, at the beginning. It is a very cheap, low-owned stack, but pretty spread out at quarterback for the most part, with Lamar, Goff, Tua being the guys I'm getting to the most. At running back, Jahmyr Gibbs, Achane, McCaffrey, who I'm way below the field, but I still have a good amount of. Barkley, Taylor, Kyron, around the field on Pollard. Not getting much Chase Brown. So seems like I'm not getting to much of the Bengals, at least in the run that I did before the show. Again, I think they're a good spot to get to. I'm not telling anyone they shouldn't go there. But for whatever reason, they seem to be a spot that I am not getting to. But priorities for me at running back in the lineups I built were Gibbs, Achane, over the field significantly on Gibbs, over the field a little bit on Barkley, over the field pretty significantly on Taylor. So those all look like pretty nice stands. ETN, I ended up around the field. I'd like more Henry, ideally. Not having him today at all would scare the shit out of me. But at the same time, he's an $8,200 non-pass catching running back when you have Gibbs, Achane, McCaffrey, Taylor, who might be a pass catching running back now, Pollard, Brown, all these guys for less. So I get it. Got to 5% Tracy. At wide receiver, Puka, mentioned I love him. I'm over the field there. Over the field on Zay Flowers. I do like that one a pretty good amount. One of my favorite, like 6K-ish wide receivers. CeeDee Lamb around the field, getting to a lot of Hollywood, getting to a decent amount of Smith and Jigba. Over the field on ASB. Again, that just comes with what I'm doing with the Lions. He's not like my favorite individual spot to be over the field on, but you're also getting sub 10% owned ASB paired with 2% owned Goff. So I don't mind it. Getting to some neighbors, a little over the field on Sutton. He is cheap. So I don't mind that. Tyreek, that goes with getting to a lot of Miami. I like being over the field on Pickens. I'm happy getting to Olave. I like that I'm over the field on Coleman. 12% Ridley puts me in line with the field. Over the field on Waddle. I like that one a lot. I probably like that even more than I like Hill. I mentioned the lower ADOT for Waddle last week. That's not ideal in terms of big plays, but it is nice for receptions. Shaheed getting 4% ownership. I'm a little bit over there at 4,500. I like that. I have 5% Tillman, which I thought was one of the more interesting, like 4K type guys. So there's nothing at wide receiver that I'm like really concerned about or that I really hate. Only 8% Higgins, only 3% Chase. Like this scares the shit out of me. I hope I get some more Bengals, honestly. But at the same time, like I'm happy with the guys I'm getting at least. It's not like I'm playing, a bunch of Jerry Jeudy instead of Jamar Chase or something. Finally, at tight end, Trey McBride, 12%, right around the field there. Getting to 27% of Juwan Johnson. I mentioned that I liked him, and I was surprised by the low ownership, so I'm cool with that. A lot of Lions tight end makes sense. A lot of Harold Fannin makes sense. Below the field on Kelsey, that I'm fine with. I would like to have more Tyler Warren, but oh well. Yeah, so tight end priorities, it looks like Juwan Johnson, Fannin, McBride, Laporta, DST, don't care too much, and it should be pretty flat, and it is. I did mention, the Ravens specifically I like. But that wraps this one up. Thank you for checking out the show. Don't forget to sign up using the link in the description below. Use all the stuff at runthesims.com. I think we have something available for everyone. Jump in Discord. That link is there as well, and it is free. You can talk in there, ask questions, whatever. Good luck on your lineups today. See you back here next week. We also have some other shows on the channel, so do subscribe to the channel as well. I may be doing some prop type shows throughout the week as well. That's possible. I'll be doing showdown shows Monday and Thursday with Neil as well, probably on his channel. So good luck today. Hopefully somebody wins $1 million. Hopefully it's me, but if not, hopefully one of you guys do. And I'll see you back here next week.